I would like to thank all of you for coming on behalf of Simple Congress. It's an honor for us to be here and to talk about my favorite subject, which is Burgundy and its wines. One of the interesting misconceptions I find about Burgundy is when you see very old bottles or you consider that the monks have been influential in Burgundy for almost 2,000 years. The idea is that modern Burgundy is in fact a region that has roots that extend for centuries. That is actually a misconception. And what I would like to do today is to bring you up to speed as to why modern Burgundy is actually not even 40 years old. This isn't to say that the influences that caused modern Burgundy to be the way it is don't exist, that they don't have historical roots, but they are in fact relatively modern. No less a person in the firmament of Burgundy today, which is Aubert de Villaine, the co-director of the Domaine de Romanée-Conti, argues, and I agree with him completely, which is to understand Burgundy today, you must understand its history. And while I don't mean to present simply a history lesson, what I'd like to do, since all of you are professionals, is to pull out the key factors that created modern Burgundy. Two things happened before the 18th century, or sorry, the 19th century, which is very, very interesting, which is you had a region that very, very early on devoted itself to one grape variety. Now, this, when you think about it on its face, makes no sense. It makes no economic sense, and it makes no practical sense. The reason is that if you only have one grape variety, it's harder to farm. If there are problems, it affects all of the crop. The second thing is that because of that, unlike Bordeaux, say, you can't blend away problems. In Bordeaux, if there's rain early, you don't use the Merlot, you use more Cabernet. If it rains late, you use more Merlot and less Cabernet. If it rains during the harvest in Burgundy, you have a big problem. The second thing is, why choose a grape variety that is notoriously difficult to grow? It's finicky, you have to farm it just right, it has thin skins, it is susceptible to rot and other diseases. If it hails, unlike Cabernet, it's not especially resistant, rot can penetrate easily. It's difficult. However, as a vector of what the microclimate has to say, in my opinion, Pinot Noir is unequaled in its sensitivity. It is, in a sense, a form of expressing liquid geography. Which brings me to the second point that is unusual at that period of time, because you have to remember, this is more than 300 years ago, is the celebration of place. Now, why did that occur? What was it about wine that could be evocative of a specific place that would have been worthy of celebrating, of delimiting, of trying to understand it? And my friend and professional colleague, Matt Kramer, who was a longtime correspondent for the Wine Spectator, has proposed the only plausible reason that I can think of that was powerful enough to overcome these difficulties of using only one grape variety. And that is that the people that were driving the popular perception of the day, which was the monks, thought that these differences that were noticed between a wine coming from that plot versus a wine coming from that plot was in fact a message from God. Now this sounds radical, and I suppose in a sense it is radical. But why else do what they did, which is, again, to make wine just from one grape variety, have very tiny plots, which, again, it's always harder to make high-quality wine consistently from very tiny plots. Typically, it's much easier if you have the whole vineyard. You can blend away differences, because if you got a hail there but not there, you can use that and not that. Again, it makes no sense unless there was an enormously powerful reason. And in those days, if they thought it was a message from God, then not only were they trying to isolate the message, to refine the message, to better understand the message, but also to celebrate the message. And that is why the little tiny plots became delimited and celebrated rather than just having it a big unwashed hole, at which point you could do what you want. The first seismic change occurred with the French Revolution. It wasn't so much that it affected Burgundy directly in terms of a change in government, but what it did do was change the ownership of the vineyards, because the vast majority of vineyards, at least those that were celebrated and already recognized as being of high quality, were owned by either the church or the royals, meaning the various princes and kings, etc., because they naturally bought the best vineyards. What happened after the revolution is that the clergy and the royals were dispossessed of these vineyards, and more people of the common clay, as it were able to buy vineyards. Another seismic change occurred shortly thereafter in 1804, when Napoleon passed what was known as the Napoleonic Code. And Napoleon was an astute politician. Some question how great a general he was, especially here perhaps, but nonetheless, he was an astute politician. And what the Napoleonic Code did was to say that all the belongings of parents had to be split equally between the children. And so for those parents that were owners of vineyards and you had 3, 4 children, those vineyards had to be divided equally among those children. Well, what this did in a succession of vineyards, a succession of generations, was to take plots that were already very small and divide them into parcels that were even smaller. This was subtle, but nonetheless, this had a dramatic effect on the division of labor in Burgundy. This is to say that that one act that Napoleon passed enabled négociants, basically merchants, to rise to power, because it was difficult to commercialize very, very small parcels because the production was so small. First of all, the farmers of that time, at the dawn of the 19th century, didn't have commercial expertise, they often didn't have capital, and so the négociants were able to buy from Peter, Paul, Jean-Marie, and combine them into something that could be commercially viable. They had contacts, and they began to export the wines to London, to Russia, to Belgium, to Switzerland, to Germany, even to the United States. And all of a sudden, there was this division of labor where the humble vigneron tended the vines, made the wine, but the province of élevage, the importance of raising the wine, bottling it, and then commercializing it, was the province of the négociants. Well, it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to understand that in that particular commercial equation, who was making the money? It wasn't the small vignerons. So not much happened beyond that in the first half of the 19th century. But what did happen in the second half of the 19th century would profoundly change Burgundy into what we see today in many respects. And that was a twofold punch in the form of phylloxera, the small little insect that ultimately killed all of the vines in Europe that were based on a system of what's known as provignage. Provignage is the way we would say is a vine layering system. And what this did was to have events or plantations that were willy-nilly. Because what you did was you took a productive vine and you dug a trench and you laid this vine down in the trench after having fumigated it to kill whatever insects might have been in there, and then cover it up. And the vine is able to sprout new production But what happened after you did that over a period of, say, 20 years is that each year you would lay this direction, this direction, this direction, and pretty soon you had one big mess. And in the density per hectare, today in Burgundy, just to give you some perspective, is roughly 10,000 vines per hectare. This is known as meter by meter planting. In the time of Provignage, you had a vine planting density of 24 to 30,000. What that effectively meant was that you could not mechanize the vineyards because you couldn't even get a horse in there. It was difficult to walk because vines were everywhere and you would have risked damaging them. When phylloxera basically destroyed more than 80% of Burgundy, the same merchants that I referred to earlier had clients that were just as thirsty before phylloxera as they were after phylloxera. And as a result, they needed wine to sell. And the south of France, and in particular Algeria, was reconstituted, replanted, long before Burgundy was. Burgundy was really stubborn because they believed that their noble Pinot Noir would never succumb to phylloxera. Well, that was a misguided belief. And in fact, what happened was Pinot Noir went down just like all the other varieties in Europe in general, and specifically France. So what happened was the second double punch is the arrival of what was known as the PLM, which was a railroad known as the Paris-Lyon Méditerranée, which went all the way from Paris down to the coast of southern France by Nice and Marseille. And what that did was enable, for the first time, a very cheap form of transport from the south to the north. And what happened was that wagon loads of trains carrying wine from the south would arrive in Burgundy. It would say vin d'Algérie, wine of Algeria. They'd take that off, put Richebourg up, and they would sell it as Richebourg. Well, what happened was that real Richebourg became fantastically expensive, but unfortunately for the purveyors of real Richebourg, such as it was at the time, people lost confidence in the name Richebourg. And all of the great names, like Latache, Romanée-Conti, Chambertin, etc., the market became very, very suspicious of those names. And in fact, they were becoming more like brands. And you remember when I started my talk that Burgundy was this land where sense of place, this somewhereness, was celebrated. Well, that risked going away. So before we get to the solution to this problem, they had to find a solution to phylloxera itself. And ultimately, someone hit upon the notion of grafting a French vine onto an American rootstock, from whence the problem came to begin with. And American vines at that time had coexisted with phylloxera, and so while they were not immune to phylloxera, they were resistant to it. And this ultimately saved all the vines of Europe, and in many cases would actually save those of California. So the first commercially viable crop that came from grafted vines was in 1893. 1893 was also, just for those of you that enjoy keeping track of historical anomalies, was the last time prior to 2003 that the Bon de Vendange, which is the officially mandated harvest date in Burgundy, because they had kept that tradition since the Dukes of Burgundy back in the 1200s had originally ordained that you couldn't pick before the Bon de Vendange. Well, that was the last time before 2003 that you had the Bon de Vendange declared in August. 110 years. So that means that not once in the 20th century was the Bon de Vendange declared in August. Just as some historical perspective, since you've had it declared in 2003, 2007, 2011, 2015, 2017, and 2018. Didn't happen in 2019, but twice in 110 years and 6 times in 15, that suggests that Burgundy's climate is changing. We'll come to that. More about that. The other thing that the grafted vines did was you could no longer use provenage. You could no longer use this vine layering system because the roots that this layering system produced would then be prey to phylloxera. So you had to have a phylloxera-resistant rootstock. So what this meant is that all of a sudden, this vine layering system that had been in Burgundy since, we believe, since 100 AD, and since you found evidence of it in 100 AD, it probably existed before that. So in the very roundest of round numbers, you had 1,900 years of a viticultural system that, in the blink of 25 years, disappeared. And what this did was it enabled growers to now plant in the neat, even rows that you see today. This had a couple of very, very important impacts. The first of which, it was mécanisable, meaning that you could mechanize this. All of a sudden, you could use a horse to go into the vineyards and do various chores. You could plow, you could treat, and it turns out that those firms that supplied agricultural implements and tools were actually quite creative about ways to increase the utility of a horse. The major problem with that is that the growers were so poor that they couldn't afford to buy a horse. Well, help to that problem would come indirectly in the form of World War I. World War I arrived in 1914, and the French army requisitioned every functional horse. Every horse that was healthy and could pull something was requisitioned. Well, come 1918, and the French army no longer needed those horses, partially because motorized transport was becoming available to the armies of the world. And the second thing is that they didn't know what to do with them. So all of a sudden, you had a huge number of horses that were available for next to nothing. And the French farmer decided that this was a good time to buy. And so most of the small growers actually bought a horse. This did a couple of things. The first thing is that labor became slightly less backbreaking. But the second thing it did was to enable a small domain, a small grower, to actually farm slightly more. And one of the big problems is that if you're farming only, say, 1 hectare, maybe half a hectare of vines, it's hard to make very much money from that. The second thing is even more important, even if it's more subtle, is that you needed a secondary source of income. And so most of the small domains, if you even would call them that, actually practiced a form of agriculture known as polyculture, meaning polyculture. So they had fruit trees, they had chickens, they had a cow. In other words, they had to feed their family in other ways than simply the vines. When you now had a horse, you could farm a greater area, and more people decided to go into vine growing as their primary source of income. Well, this would have profound implications for the ownership profiles of Burgundy, as well as the expertise. However, fraud had not gone away. It was a whole lot easier to buy wagon loads of cheap wine from the south, ship it up north cheaply by the railroads, and sell it as the real article. In fact, there is a famous quote that said that the cheapest and best Burgundy is that which Burgundy never produced, meaning that fake Burgundy was a lot more profitable than real Burgundy because of yields. Pinot Noir, at least when you make fine Pinot Noir, it's not productive, meaning that the yields necessarily have to be lower for a couple of reasons. One, you need the concentration, and two, especially in those days when you had often a series of very poor vintages, the fruit wouldn't get ripe. And so all of these factors combined to all of a sudden have a revolt. because phylloxera had wiped out many of the vineyards. Many of the small growers could not afford to replant them. It's difficult to believe, given how expensive real estate is in Burgundy today, but by the dawn of the 1920s, 66% of all of the vineyards in the Côte d'Or that had been planted prior to 1875 were simply abandoned. Think about how much Cros Parentu sells for today. If you can find a bottle for less than $2,000, it's a bargain. Today, that vineyard was abandoned until the early 1950s. So that just gives you an idea. I have a photo that was given to me by Paul Pernaut that was taken in Pouligny-Montrachet, looking upslope in the vineyards, and that photo was taken in the 1950s. And when you look at it closely, most of that hillside is bare, meaning there are no vines because they were too difficult to work. It was too steep for a horse, and it was backbreaking, and usually when you planted something, the vines died. So it was very, very difficult times. So what happened? Well, there were protests in the streets, and ultimately there came a political debate as to what to do over the protection of these storied place names. And it was a massive debate because the big negociants, for the most part, had everything to lose and nothing to gain by passing protections against fraudulent Burgundy. The small grower, on the other hand, who was trying to eke out a living, said, no, we need to do this. We need to protect the integrity of the place name. We need to protect the integrity of the vineyard delimitations that were established as far back as the 18th century. In a remarkable series of books, 1827, 1831, 1855, and again in 1861, these vineyards, all of the Côte d'Or, was codified into a hierarchy. And it is remarkable to think that this didn't just happen out of thin air. And the other thing that is remarkable to consider is how they correlated with one another. There were very, very few disagreements. What this says is that the notion of the hierarchy of vineyard quality had existed long before this period. And that's important because what ultimately happened in 1935 was the introduction of the AOC system, specifically designed to protect the integrity of the place names, but more importantly, saying that wine quality is tied to where it's grown. And there is something fascinating about this, because what it says is that normally, you look at the US, you look at Russia, you look at France, you look at most modern societies today, is that when big money wants something, usually big money wins. And what is remarkable about this in the 1930s, especially when there was worldwide depression, and big money had even more influence than it typically does, is that big money lost. This is critical, because what it said, more than anything else, is that Burgundy would remain what I like to call a land of born, rather than a land of made. And what does that mean? What that means is that the intrinsic character of a wine is largely composed of where it was grown and how it was farmed, not whether somebody made their sauce and said, this is a good wine. And the distinction is critical to the way that Burgundy is grown, the way it's vinified, the way it's marketed, and the way we as consumers appreciate it. Along comes World War II. World War II caused a lot of problems, but some of the advances that were put through in technology due to the army was ultimately adopted for the benefit of vignerons. What is interesting is for those of you that know the little village of Océ-d'Arès, there was a squadron of German tanks that were retreating in 1944, and a couple of squadrons of English planes saw them, destroyed the tanks, and two engineers from the little town of Océ-d'Arès, which today might have 200 people in it, actually took the pieces of these destroyed tanks and made the very first tractor out of them. They actually patented it, and while they weren't particularly well adapted to the hillsides of Burgundy because they're so steep, and to combat erosion, they're actually planted north-south. And so what that means is that given the hillside goes east-west, is that the tractor is like this, and they easily tipped over, which is not good for your tractor, and it's not good for your tractor driver. But they slowly got better and became more adapted, and this had the same profound changes for the life of the small vigneron that the arrival of the horse did in the 1900s, or I should say, the first decade of the 1900s. What this also meant is that work got a little easier, but more importantly, all of a sudden, they could farm more vineyards. And so for the first time in 50 years, the small advantage that the horse gave, where somebody could go from 1 hectare to 2 hectares, now with a tractor, especially with all the implements that you could spray, you could fertilize, you could plow, all of a sudden yields went up, and you could now go from, say, 2 hectares to maybe 5 or 6. And that is a sea change in terms of the economics, because now a lot of expensive equipment that you're only going to use once a year, I mean, think about your stainless steel tanks, think about your stemmer crushers, think about all of the implements that you use, but you're only going to use them once a year. Well, spreading the cost of that over 5 or 6 hectares makes it a lot easier to afford than if you're only doing it over 4 or 5. Another thing happened, which is that after World War II, all of the chemical salesmen that were selling lots and lots of very bad things to armies all over the place so that people could kill one another with them, they still had jobs and they still needed to sell chemicals. Well, all of a sudden, they convinced vignerons in Burgundy that if they put generous amounts of nitrogen and generous amounts of potassium in the soil, they could increase yields. And it is, again, when you look at Burgundy through our eyes today, it is difficult to believe, in fact, almost impossible to believe, that almost no domains made money in most of the 20th century. In fact, most domains weren't profitable until the 1980s. It's incredible to think that the first year that the Domaine de la Romanée-Conti made a profit was 1959. And you look at what those wines sell for today, it's almost unimaginable. A couple of other things happened, is that science started to become more precise. For example, in 1957, they could finally have a test where the mallow could be determined, whether the malolactic had terminated, could be determined with certainty. And so an awful lot of Burgundy was no longer being bottled before the mallow had finished, because they could tell now, okay, not a good time to bottle it because you risk having almost sparkling Burgundy without intending to have sparkling Burgundy. So this continued through the 1970s. And if you would like to look at the 20th century in terms of wine quality, you could argue that the 1970s was the worst decade of the century. This was a combination of a couple of things. When I talk about profitability, the most expensive thing in winemaking is yields. And if you're not making very much money, the only way to make more of it is to produce more wine. There are a couple of ways you can do this. You can buy more land, but that was becoming more expensive. And secondly, you'd have to have another tractor, and you'd have to have a staff. And so the easier approach, especially with the chemicals that were available, is simply to produce more wine. Well, Chardonnay is actually fairly forgiving in terms of yields and wine quality. Pinot Noir is not. Generally speaking, when you look at all of the 100 vintages of the 20th century, there are exactly 5 that you could say made high quality and high quantity, which were 1929, 34, 59, 1990, and 1999. And when viewed through that optic, a lot of people said, let's produce more wine. Well, unfortunately, Mother Nature didn't cooperate. And she didn't cooperate because in the entire decade, there were only 2 vintages of any particular consequence, which were 1971 and 1978. The rest of them were somewhere between average to just downright awful. They didn't yet have sorting tables, so the idea of a triage was being done in the vineyards, but they weren't really motivated to throw much out in terms of substandard fruit, because, again, volume was important. The other thing that I alluded to earlier is, unfortunately, that most of the harvests were occurring in October. And what happens in October? Well, for one thing, the hours of daylight that are available to you are decreasing. So it's not like waiting when it's August or early September. When you still have daylight, you still have warmth. In October, you don't have that so much. And so when you have these very high yields, and the way I like to analogize it is that if you're a vine and you have 2 bunches, or you have 12 bunches, it's a bit like a family that has 2 children or it has 12 children. If you have 2 children and they're gifted, they could go to the very best universities. You can probably afford to send 2 kids to an expensive university. If you have 12 kids, you can't do that. They may be equally smart, but they're probably going to get scholarships. And the analogy to a vine is that the vine, depending on how it's farmed, it's producing a certain amount of energy, meaning that in terms of how that vine can nourish those bunches, it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much energy to allocate to the bunches, and it's a lot easier to get them ripe if you've got 2, 3, or 4 bunches versus 12. And in the days where people were farming for volume, and you had basically a crappy vintage that wasn't going to be picked until the middle of October, the chances of that fruit being ripe were virtually non-existent. And so it was with considerable relief that Burgundy moved into the 80s. However, before we get there, there is one seminal aspect that occurred in 1973 that is worth bringing to your attention. For those of you that are only slightly less old than I am, you may remember that OPEC in 1973 had an oil embargo. This caused a worldwide recession. What that meant was that people stopped buying wine in general. In fact, they stopped buying quote-unquote luxury goods in general. The impact in Burgundy was that the négociants said, we don't have customers that are going to buy the wines because they were still the major league players in the day, and so they stopped buying. And so the small vignerons said, well, eating is good, I like to eat, and if the négociants aren't going to buy my wine, then I have to figure out how to make a living. And so the very first tentative steps were taken towards what is known as domain bottling. Domain bottling would change Burgundy profoundly. However, the other reason that the 1970s were basically a forgettable decade was that you had all these series of very poor vintages. Wine quality wasn't very good. And now you had growers who were trying to figure out how to do élevage. Because if you remember the way I explained it, that the growers farmed the vines, they made the wine, then they gave the wine in barrel to the négociants. who would do the élevage, do the bottling, and ultimately commercialize the wine. So basically, you had domains that were now having to learn the art of élevage. And as Jamie said in his talk, élevage is a much underappreciated aspect of the creation of a wine. And the second thing is that for the most part, they did not have a reservoir or a network of commercial customers. So the domains, in addition to doing their normal work, now had to learn skills that were completely foreign to them. That's another reason why there was a lot of bad Burgundy being produced. And most of them couldn't afford bottling lines. And about the same time, some enterprising fellow in Burgundy came up with the idea of a mobile bottling line. And this enabled them to take technology that would have been too expensive for a given domain to buy, but they could buy one, use it, and it would go to the next domain and so forth. That was affordable. Problem is that most of the bottlers at the time didn't want recriminations later from growers, and so they strip filtered and added tons of SO2. This took an already poor product and made it poorer. So all of this means that you had this lost decade, and what happened? Well, thankfully, you had a group of very young growers who came together and said, we got to change this. This isn't working. They had gone out into the world to do stages, meaning internships. And ultimately, they said, this isn't acceptable. They tasted the wines of their grandfathers, and then they tasted the wines of their fathers and said, this is seriously upside down. And so guys like Dominique Lafont, Christophe Roumier, and a bunch of others that I could name basically had a revolution. And Burgundy in the 1980s became Back to the Future, which is essentially that we're going to change the viticulture. We're going to get rid of the fertilizers. We are going to try and farm more respectfully in order to try and produce higher quality fruit. With higher quality fruit, you can make better wine. That was the major change in the 1980s. The 1990s would see a huge improvement either because of climate change or just blind luck. Nobody is entirely certain, and it doesn't really matter. You really only had one poor vintage the entire decade, 1994. I did my stage in Burgundy in 1994, so I saw the rain, I saw the mud, I saw the rot, I saw the unripe berries. So I understand why it wasn't great. But one fundamental change happened that is perhaps one of the most powerful changes in the entire history of Burgundy, and it sounds incredibly simple, and in a way it is, but it's just the humble sorting table. And all of a sudden they got cheap enough, and people said to themselves, wow, my neighbor is making better wine than me, what is he doing that I'm not doing? And most of the time it was either yields or a sorting table or both. And all of a sudden, you had the ability to get rid of substandard fruit. And so now you're making wine from fruit that is clean and ripe. And that was an inestimable advantage in terms of wine quality. The other thing that helped, of course, is you had more domains now having perfected the art of élevage. So there was a lot more excellent Burgundy available, and you had people noticing. Consumers, like all of you, were noticing the improvement in quality in Burgundy. And that brought sales. We get to the decade, the first decade of the 21st century. Not much changed in terms of fundamental shifts in either technology or philosophy. But again, more growers producing better wine, and the world fell in love with Burgundy. That was good from the standpoint of having more good Burgundy on the market, but it wasn't great in terms of prices. All of a sudden, Burgundy, I still remember walking in 2002, not that long ago, to a shop in LA. There were 5 cases of the Armand Rousseau Clos Saint-Jacques, 1999. And I asked how much I could have. He said, take it all. Today, you'd be lucky to get a bottle or two. That just tells you how dramatically things have changed. what I want to leave you with before I turn it over for questions is one aspect about the current state of Burgundy, which is land prices and inheritance. I skipped over Primox. We could talk about that. That's a subject that would go on for a while. But two things that are critical from the standpoint of the future of Burgundy is not the commitment of the young vignerons. They're educated, they're committed. I think Burgundy is in good hands. However, big money didn't go away. Big money's back. You see again and again insurance companies, rich individuals, whether they be Russian, Chinese, American, or the French themselves, doesn't matter. They want in. And that changes the complexity of a small domain that's been family owned and family run for generations. Now, big money's back. And I can tell you as a former investment banker, money might sleep for a little while, it doesn't sleep for long. That has the potential to change this sort of farmer aspect that we have appreciated about Burgundy for generations. And the inheritance tax only makes things worse in France. And so it's very difficult for some of these domains to pay that inheritance tax. And usually the only way to do that is to sell some of the vineyards that enables them to make the wine to begin with. I think on that note, we can turn it over to questions.
Да. Yes, please. Давайте поаплодируем Аллену Мидоусу. Это, ну, и так как я очень долго ждал, очень долго ждал Аллена здесь у нас, поэтому здесь в Москве, на площадке Simple Congress, я позволю себе задать первый вопрос. Это будет небольшим сюрпризом для Аллена, но, опять же, мы любим сюрпризы в России. Я сейчас попрошу вывести короткий видеоролик на экран, а потом задам свой вопрос, чтобы вы вообще понимали, с кем мы сейчас разговариваем, помимо специалиста по Бургундии. Так. Okay. Кто так может еще кто-нибудь? Кто так может? Давайте руки поднимем, давайте поаплодируем, это великолепно. Вы представляете? Насколько...
That was not my idea.
But this is really great. И в связи с этим у меня вопрос. Очевидно, что помимо увлечения вином, также у вас большое увлечение спортом. Там есть еще видео такого характера. Поэтому, собственно, мой вопрос звучит так. Как можно сочетать увлечение вином и серьезный спорт? Не побоюсь этого слова. Как это сбалансировать правильно?
It's really self-preservation, because if you don't do something, I'd be like this and probably not very healthy. So I take staying in shape seriously because I think I'm a better critic. Because of it, I can cover more domains and you have a better quality of life.
Ну, а вообще вино, алкоголь, не алкоголь, вино сочетается со здоровым образом жизни, в вашем понимании? Или это часть?
In fact, I drink very little hard alcohol. Sorry, no vodka. But really no brandy, no spirits. But I think a glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine with a meal in the evening is, in fact, not only civilized, but it enhances my appreciation for life in general. And I'd recommend it to everybody. I'm sure that everybody, I don't know about everybody does that, but most people sitting here have an appreciation for what wine has to say. And it's, for me, it's just part of a healthy lifestyle.
Спасибо большое. Что ж, у нас есть вопрос. Давайте поаплодируем еще раз. Еще раз, это круто. Я прям когда увидел, это было здорово. Так, у нас есть еще один человек здесь. Он, правда, в России занимается примерно столько же винами Бургундии, сколько Аллен Мидоус. Это Павел Мартюшев. Он хотел задать вопрос. Паш, так, как мне тебе передать микрофон? Один из, скажем так, один из первых российских сомелье. Паш, у тебя очень хороший вопрос, пожалуйста.
Спасибо. Мы благодарны вам, что у нас есть возможность пообщаться с вами, но вопрос немножко такой, даже немножко политический. Понимаю, что не к вам, но все-таки отголоски будут касаться и винного мира. Напряженность, связанная с некоторыми политическими вопросами, и то, что господин Трамп, возможно, ведет заградительные санкции, связанные с Европой, и как это коснется винного мира. Мы имеем в виду ввозной налог 25%. Вино, вода, сыры. Спасибо.
Yeah, it's a serious concern for those consumers in the United States that risk having something, in particular Burgundy, but Champagne, upper-level Bordeaux, to have a 25% excise tax that will do nothing with respect to enriching the United States coffers, because it's still not enough to matter. And it's simply a political weapon against the French. To hit them in theory where it might hurt. I find it deplorable. I'm strongly against it, but unfortunately I don't have a seat at the table to vote.
Спасибо. Что ж, есть ли у нас еще вопросы в зале? Давайте зададим вопросы с экранов. Вот хороший вопрос. Есть ли потолок, то есть высшая планка цен у бургундских вин? Не являются ли бургундцы заложниками своих цен, так как растет прослойка wine lovers, которые не смогут позволить себе пить вина Гран-Крю и, следовательно, переключаться на иные регионы, успешно работающие с пино-нуаром и шардоне?
I agree completely with the idea that Burgundy is not doing itself a favor, because what you're really creating, I should say the market is creating, perhaps inadvertently, but nonetheless creating, are two classes of Burgundy, where you have, the number's not clear exactly, but maybe 35 domains. We could name them all when you combine red and white, Chablis, where there seems to be no limit to the price for their Grand Cru. Yet you have another 3,000 domains that sit below that 35 or 40, whose wines remain reasonable. And again, unfortunately, is that these top domains are becoming brands rather than domains. And it's become a luxury good. And as long as there is enough wealth in the world for people to pay for the prestige of having La Tâche on the table, or Le Fleuve Montrachet, or choose your very, very expensive wine, the good news is that below that 35 or 40 domains, you have a lot of excellent Burgundy that will continue to be available for reasonable prices. Unfortunately, the perception of Burgundy as being expensive is driven by these very top domains, and those wines are eye-poppingly expensive. But when you go down to Volnay or Pommard or Auxey-Derez or Centenay or Chassagne, those wines aren't cheap, but we are not into three figures for even the best wines from those communes. So good Burgundy remains affordable. It's not cheap, but it remains affordable. Excuse me. There is one other aspect to this, which is the other thing that's important to do. I practice this myself because it sounds a bit like you don't need to drink a Grand Cru on Sunday. You can drink a Premier Cru or a Village. But to buy up and down the appellation hierarchy, which is to say that Bourgogne regional wines and Village level wines have a place in your cellars. There's two reasons for that. One is that they're cheaper. The second thing is that it allows you to drink something, if well chosen, that's very good, and it also enables you to leave your best wines alone and let them have the time in the cellar that they deserve.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Аллен. И второй вопрос от поклонника и регулярного, скажу такое американское слово, юзер, и регулярного юзера портала burghound.com, собственно, который задает вопрос, человек, который пользуется каждую неделю вашим порталом. Ожидаются ли какие-либо изменения в поиске по оценкам и интерфейсе сайта?
The question was, will we have changes in the interface for Berghound and the scoring system? We, along with Erica, are always looking at ways to improve the site. While there are no specific changes specifically in mind, that's not to say that there won't be. In terms of the scoring, no, I don't anticipate changing my philosophy there. I'm deliberately conservative because I want, say, let's just choose a number that seems to be important to a lot of consumers, which is 90 points. Anything that receives 90 points or above for me, I want people to go, wow, that is clearly a wine of quality. And if I've done my job as a journalist, which is to describe accurately that wine, you will find a wine of quality and a wine that will probably suit your taste because, again, as Jamie pointed out, taste is taste is taste is taste. But what you want is a wine of quality that corresponds to your taste. And therein lies the journalistic aspect of it because the critic aspect is to assess the quality. We all do that differently, but that's a role of a critic. The second part, as a journalist, is to accurately describe that wine in terms of our perceptions of the wine. And assuming that I have done that, then a wine that is scored 90 or above, I think you should find to be a wine of quality, and hopefully one that will please you.
Спасибо. Есть ли еще какой-то вопрос из зала? Есть вопрос. Так, ну, давайте два вопроса как раз сейчас сюда, здесь поближе идти просто, потом к Томасу.
Спасибо. День добрый. Значит, у меня следующий вопрос. Мы сегодня перелистнули несколько страниц истории бургундского вина и видели, что на разных этапах то модернизация, то виноделы, то еще что-то играло роль для продвижения этого вина. Ваши прогнозы, раз у нас сегодня люди, изменившие мир вина, да, то кто в ближайшие 10-15 лет, по вашему мнению, будет диктовать моду на бургундские вина? Инвесторы, производители, покупатели или все-таки производители этого вина?
Отличный вопрос.
That's an excellent question. I wish I knew the answer. My guess is that it will be a confluence of producers and consumers. Producers can lead, but it's consumers that decide whether to follow or not. For example, a movement that has been going on for the last 10 years, more or less, is whether to use whole cluster or not in the vinifications, and if so, how much. You can have whole cluster has been around since the 19th century, if not longer, because crusher stemmers that didn't absolutely wreck the fruit have been around, but not very. They were never very effective. In fact, they probably did more harm than good. Now you have crusher stemmers that are so delicate you can actually remove the berry and get the intracellular fermentation and leave the stem. I personally, it's a personal preference. I love whole cluster. And there are more and more Burgundians that are using at least a percentage of it. I suspect that trend will continue. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, you're getting riper fruit. You need reasonably ripe stems to be able to use it, at least in a higher proportion. The second thing is that with better treatments, you can actually get very, very ripe stems without the rot. Stems are a magnet for rot, and that you absolutely don't want that in the fermenters. But with good treatments, with good sorting tables, and higher levels of ripeness, I suspect that we will see more whole cluster. One of the things that typically does, though, I mean, there's a big debate about whether this creates wines that have more finesse or less finesse, but I usually find that they create wine with more structure. Whether that will comport with consumers that generally prefer to drink their wines younger now because we live in apartments, we don't necessarily have large cellars where we can wait 20 years for those wines to mature, that remains an open question as to whether whole cluster will continue to proliferate at the rate that it's been going. I don't think money per se is going to drive it, but it may change the face of domains in terms of their ownership. And that is something that could be problematic because investors always want a return. I always use the example of Claude Lombre. You had a Mr. Freund who in 1996 bought Claude Lombre. Everybody said, oh, it doesn't matter, he's a wine lover. It's okay, because he's a wine lover. This isn't a criticism of his family, but look what happened. He wasn't dead 6 months before the domain was for sale. And so just because the first buyer is a wine lover, has good intentions, invests in the domain, let Thierry Brouin do what he wanted, basically, to continue what was a family-owned domain, that doesn't mean the second owner will. And that, I think, is the big risk of large money coming in. Large money in and of itself isn't bad, but it's unpredictable.
Спасибо. И еще один вопрос. Вопрос этот задаст, в общем-то, тоже человек, который занимается вином, тоже из Америки. Но, правда, это не Роберт Паркер. Это Томас Энтони. Он задаст следующий вопрос.
I'll speak in English.
Great.
That's my native language as well, and they'll translate for everyone else. My question actually links to what you were just talking about now. I was really concerned that at the end of your talk, after a really interesting overview of some very good things that have happened in Burgundy through history, as well as some bad, it ended in a really grim, it seemed to me, note about the combination of big money and inheritance laws posing a real threat to Burgundy. Do you have any reason to have any optimism to go with that ominous description?
Sure, absolutely. Potential threats have yet to be realized, so that's one positive right away. But it would be remiss of me not to at least acknowledge that the past 25 years, which I think we could reasonably describe as the golden age of Burgundy, are not without storm clouds on the horizon. Now, whether those storm clouds actually bring floods, disaster, and hurricanes, it remains to be seen. I, for one, am optimistic. Burgundy has been through an amazing number of ups and downs when you look at all of the factors and phenomena that I described over the past 300 years. I think it can weather this as well. The key question that raises itself, though, is whether what comes out on the other side is the humble Burgundy that we all know and love, or will it take on more of a Bordeaux-esque, a little bit of polish here and there, where when you shake the hands of the vignerons, they're not calluses anymore, and hopefully they still know where their vineyards are. And so there risks being some of that as well. On the other hand, perhaps that's what will enable us to continue to appreciate the small domain that knows precisely where its vineyards are and continues to honor the traditions that made the region famous in the first place.
Спасибо большое. Ну что ж, спасибо. Давайте поаплодируем. Это было выступление легенды, в общем-то, винного нашего мира, Аллена Мидоуса. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Что ж.
Could I add one
you wanna have-
final, this takes 2 minutes? Yeah, sure. I ran out of time before the questions, but I did want to, since we talked about a huge span of time in Burgundy, I would point out that the first vineyard that we are aware of that was delimited by the monks of Bèze was Claude Bèze, and that was in 640. It is, I think, remarkable by any stretch of the imagination that a vineyard has been famous for almost 1,400 years. Now, I talked about lots and lots of changes that occurred, particularly with respect to technology, ownership profiles, phylloxera, how mechanization changed things, and how the balance of power shifted between negociants and the small grower. But none of that changes the fact that there have been literally more than 100 generations of winemakers and consumers that have been interested in understanding the message in Claude Bèze. It's fascinating to think. It's a powerful message to say that whatever that piece of dirt has to say, people have been interested in that message for a very, very long time. And I think that's what makes Burgundy so fascinating today, is to hear that message. So with that, thank you very much.